The back room fell silent when the waitress hit the table, and when the man in the black suit stepped inside, every smile died. They had her pinned, phones recording, voices mocking her struggle like it was entertainment. But Scott Bird didn't come to watch. He came to end it. And by morning, the entire district would whisper his name like a ghost story. If you're hooked in and want to enjoy this story, go ahead and subscribe and drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see where everyone's watching. Plus, tomorrow I've got another incredible story lined up, and you definitely don't want to miss it. Alright, back to the story. The rusted sparrow usually smelled like old whiskey, cigarette smoke, and the faint chemical tang of industrial cleaner trying to mask decades of grime. It was the kind of bar that existed in the margins, a dim refuge for people who needed to disappear for an hour or a night. The overhead lights flickered more often than they stayed steady, casting jagged shadows across cracked leather booths and water-stained walls. The jukebox in the corner played Motown classics no one listened to anymore. Outside, the street was darker. The district had given up on streetlights years ago. Inside, the regulars kept their heads down and their business quiet. Deals were made in whispers. Drinks were poured without questions. The rusted sparrow wasn't safe, exactly, but it was neutral ground. At least, it had been. But tonight, the air felt heavier. It didn't smell like refuge. It smelled like gasoline and sweat, the kind of tension that makes your teeth ache before violence breaks loose. Victoria Hopkins stood in the back hallway near the storage room, her fingers gripping an empty tray so tightly the plastic creaked. She was 26 but looked younger under the flickering yellow bulbs, her dark skin glowing faintly in the half-light. She wore a simple black shirt and jeans, her natural hair pulled back into a low, tight bun, everything about her designed to avoid attention. She kept her shoulders hunched, her eyes lowered. She had learned long ago that invisibility was survival. It was only her third week. She needed this job. She needed the cash tips that came in crumpled bills, the kind of money that couldn't be traced by the ex-boyfriend she'd fled from 2 states over. Every time the front door opened, her pulse spiked, a Pavlovian response to 3 years of flinching at footsteps. Every raised voice made her hands shake. But when the back door slammed open at 9:47 p.m., it wasn't her past that stumbled in. It was something worse. The group didn't walk in. They invaded. 4 men, loud and drunk, their laughter aggressive and performative, the kind meant to claim territory. They weren't customers. They were hunters who'd found prey. Leading them was a man built like a wrecking ball, broad-shouldered, pale, with a shaved head and a neck thick as a tree trunk. He wore a stained, denim jacket over a tank top that showed off arms covered in faded prison tattoos. His smile was cruel, his eyes flat and calculating. Behind him, 3 others, one filming with his phone, another cracking his knuckles, the third already leering at Victoria like she was something he'd won in a bet. The few patrons in the main bar glanced up, then immediately looked away. This was the district's oldest rule. Don't see, don't hear, don't get involved. The bartender turned his back to wipe down glasses he'd already cleaned. A woman near the jukebox grabbed her purse and quietly slipped out the side exit. Victoria was alone. "Hey, sweetheart." The leader's voice was rough, edged with mockery. He didn't ask, he commanded. "Get us some drinks, and don't take all night." Victoria's throat closed. She nodded once, gripping the tray, trying to move past them toward the bar. But the leader stepped into her path. The others closed in behind her, cutting off the exit. "Where you going so fast?" he said, grinning. One of his friends laughed, a high, ugly sound. Victoria backed up, her spine hitting the edge of the storage room doorway. Her breath came shallow, her vision narrowed. She knew this feeling. She knew what came next. The leader reached for her wrist. And the back room door opened. Not slammed, not thrown. Opened with the kind of controlled precision that made the hinges whisper instead of scream. The sound cut through the laughter like a knife through silk. Every head turned. The man who stepped inside didn't hurry. He didn't shout. He simply stood in the doorway, one hand resting at his side, the other adjusting the cuff of his black suit jacket, with the casual elegance of someone who had never needed to raise his voice to command a room. Scott Bird. He was tall, over 6 feet, but it wasn't his height that made the air compress. It was the way he carried himself. Immaculate posture, shoulders squared, spine straight as a blade. His suit was tailored within an inch of its life, the kind of expensive simplicity that whispered wealth and violence in equal measure. Black jacket, black vest, white shirt open at the collar. No tie. Tattooed hands, knuckles scarred and deliberate, rested against the dark fabric like weapons sheathed but ready. His face was sharp, jaw carved from stone, dark eyes that didn't blink, didn't scan, didn't search. They simply assessed. He looked at the scene the way a surgeon looks at a body on the table, calculating incisions, measuring damage, deciding where to cut first. The leader's grin faltered. Scott didn't speak. He took 3 steps forward, closing the distance with terrifying calm. His shoes, polished leather, expensive, barely made a sound on the concrete floor. "Hey man, the leader started. Scott reached out, grabbed both of the man's wrists, and twisted. The snap was clean, surgical. 2 bones breaking in perfect sequence, one after the other, like branches cracking under ice, the kind. Leader's scream tore through the room. Chaos erupted. One of the other men lunged forward. Scott pivoted, caught him by the back of the neck, and slammed his face into the wooden table with a dull, sickening thud. The man crumpled, blood streaming from his nose, his phone clattering to the floor, still recording. Another attacker swung wildly. Scott sidestepped, caught the man's wrist mid-swing, and threw him to the ground with such effortless force that the floorboards shook. The man gasped. The wind knocked clean out of his lungs. The 4th man didn't move. He simply backed into the corner, hands raised, eyes wide with the kind of primal terror that comes from realizing you've made a fatal miscalculation. The leader was on his knees, cradling his ruined wrists, sobbing. Scott stood over him, straightening his jacket, brushing an invisible speck of dust from his sleeve. The entire room had gone silent. Victoria was pressed against the wall, trembling, her legs barely holding her upright. She couldn't process what she'd just witnessed, couldn't understand why this stranger, this terrifyingly composed man in a suit that cost more than her rent, had stepped in at all. Footsteps echoed from the main bar. Heavy boots, radios crackling. The police. 2 officers appeared in the doorway, hands on their belts, scanning the wreckage. Their eyes landed on Scott, and something shifted in their posture. Not aggression, deference. "Mr. Bird," the older officer said, his voice careful, respectful. "Is there a problem here?" Scott glanced at the men on the floor, then back at the officer. His expression didn't change. "No problem, Officer Callahan," Scott said, his voice smooth, almost bored. "Just a misunderstanding." They slipped. The officer's eyes flicked to the broken wrists, the blood on the table, the man still gasping on the floor. He nodded slowly. "Right. Slipped." He turned to his partner. "Let's get them out of here." The officers hauled the men to their feet, gently, carefully, as if afraid to disturb the scene further. The leader was still crying. They didn't cuff him. They didn't ask questions. They simply removed him, like trash taken out after closing. The door swung shut. Scott turned to Victoria. She flinched. He noticed. His expression softened. Barely, just enough to register as human instead of predatory. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a white handkerchief, monogrammed in black thread. He held it out to her, arm extended, but didn't step closer, didn't touch her. "Are you harmed?" he asked quietly. Victoria shook her head, unable to speak. Her hands trembled as she took the handkerchief, clutching it like a lifeline. Scott studied her for a moment longer, his dark eyes unreadable. Then he adjusted his cuffs one final time, turned on his heel, and walked out without another word. The door closed behind him with a soft click. Victoria stood alone in the back room, surrounded by overturned chairs, blood on the floor, and the faint scent of expensive cologne. By dawn, the district was whispering. Scott Bird claimed the waitress. The whispers started before Victoria's next shift. She arrived at the Rusted Sparrow on Thursday evening, 3 days after the back room, and immediately felt the change. The bartender, Marcus, a grizzled man in his 50s who usually barely acknowledged her, looked up when she walked in. His eyes held something new, not quite pity, not quite fear. Something worse, careful distance, like she'd become radioactive overnight. "You okay?" he asked, his voice too gentle, too deliberate. Victoria nodded, tying her apron with hands that still trembled when she thought too hard about broken wrists and the sound of bones snapping. "Yeah, I'm fine." Marcus didn't look convinced, but he didn't push. He just turned back to his bottles, shoulders tense, like he was waiting for something to explode. The regulars were worse. Old Joe, who usually sat in the corner booth nursing the same beer for 3 hours, watched her walk past with wide, nervous eyes. The couple at table 4, college kids who came in weekly, stopped mid-conversation when she approached, then whispered to each other the second she turned away. Victoria caught fragments throughout the night. "That's her. Scott Bird, I'm telling you." Broke both their arms. Claimed her. That word. Claimed. Like she was property. Like she'd been marked, branded, transferred from one set of hands to another. By midnight, Victoria felt more exposed than she had when those men pinned her to the table. At least then, she'd known what was happening. This? This was a spotlight she didn't ask for, burning into her skin, turning her into a legend she didn't want to be. She was wiping down tables near closing when the door opened. The room went silent. Scott Bird walked in. He wore the same black suit, the same immaculate composure. His dark eyes swept the bar once, efficient, assessing, before he moved to the corner booth, the one farthest from the door, half hidden in shadow. He sat down without acknowledging anyone, folded his hands on the table, and simply waited. Marcus poured a whiskey without being asked and slid it across the bar. Scott nodded once. The bartender retreated. Victoria's heart hammered. She could feel every eye in the room tracking her movements, waiting to see what she'd do. The weight of their expectations pressed down on her shoulders like lead. She forced her legs to move, one step, then another, until she stood beside his table, hands clutched in front of her, knuckles white. "Mr. Bird," she said quietly, the words catching in her throat, "I thank you for what you did." Scott looked up at her. His expression was unreadable, carved from stone and shadow. He didn't smile, didn't soften. He simply studied her with those dark, calculating eyes. "You don't owe me thanks," he said, his voice low and even. "You didn't deserve what happened." Victoria swallowed hard. "Everyone thinks they're saying you—" "I know what they're saying." Silence hung between them, heavy and suffocating. "Is it true?" Victoria asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Did you claim me?" Scott's jaw tightened, just a fraction, the only crack in his armor. "No," he said quietly. "But they'll believe it anyway. It'll keep you safer than the truth." Victoria didn't know how to respond. Safer. She'd traded one cage for another, her father's fists, her ex's control, and now this, protection wrapped in rumors that made her a possession instead of a person. "I didn't ask for this," she said, and hated how small her voice sounded. Scott's gaze held hers. "I know." He didn't apologize, didn't explain further. He simply picked up his whiskey, took a slow sip, and looked away, dismissing her without cruelty, but with finality. Victoria walked back to the bar, feeling the weight of every stare following her. Scott came back the next night, and the night after that. He always sat in the same corner booth, always ordered the same whiskey, always stayed until closing. He never spoke to anyone, never caused trouble. He just watched. Silent, present, a sentinel carved from shadows and expensive fabric. The bar changed around him. Rowdy customers lowered their voices when they noticed him. Men who used to leer at the waitresses suddenly became polite. The air felt thicker, charged with an unspoken rule: behave or face the consequences. Victoria felt the shift, but she didn't know if it was protection or imprisonment. The whispers grew louder. Scott Bird watches over her. She's his now. No one touches her, not unless they want to disappear. Victoria served drinks, cleared tables, and tried to ignore the way people looked at her, like she was a myth, a warning, a story they'd tell their friends about the girl who survived and the monster who decided she was worth saving. And every night, Scott sat in his corner, silent as a ghost, rewriting the rules of the district one quiet hour at a time. 2 weeks passed like a slow-motion standoff. Every night, Scott arrived at 9 p.m. and left at closing. Every night, Victoria felt the weight of his presence pressing against her ribs, suffocating and strangely comforting all at once. She couldn't reconcile the contradiction. The man who broke bones with surgical precision, now sitting quietly in a corner booth like a well-dressed ghost haunting the bar. She wanted to ignore him, to pretend he was just another customer. But every time she refilled his whiskey, their eyes met for a fraction of a second, and the question burned hotter in her chest. Why? On a Tuesday night, long after Marcus locked the front door and disappeared into the back office to count the till, Victoria found herself standing beside Scott's table, a damp rag twisted between her hands. The bar was empty, silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic bleeding through the walls. Scott looked up from his glass, waiting. "Why did you help me?" Victoria's voice cracked on the last word, betraying the tremor she'd been holding back for weeks. Scott's expression didn't change. He gestured to the seat across from him. "Sit." Victoria hesitated, then lowered herself into the booth, the vinyl creaking under her weight. She kept her hands in her lap, fingers knotted together. "You didn't know me," she continued, the words tumbling out faster now. "You didn't owe me anything, so why—" "You froze," Scott said quietly, cutting through her spiral. "When they grabbed you, you didn't fight back." Shame flooded Victoria's chest, hot and acidic. She looked down at the table, at the faint water rings left by 1,000 glasses. "I know. I should have. I'm not criticizing you." Victoria's head snapped up. Scott's gaze was steady, unflinching. "I'm asking why," he said. The question hung in the air between them, heavier than any accusation. Victoria's throat tightened. She hadn't said it out loud. Not to anyone. Not even to herself most days. But something about the way Scott looked at her, not with pity, not with judgment, just with patient, terrible understanding, made the words claw their way up. "My father," she whispered. He punished noise. If I cried, if I talked back, if I made any sound he didn't like," her voice broke. "He taught me that silence kept me safe, that if I just disappeared into myself, it would be over faster." Scott's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. "And then my ex," Victoria continued, the dam breaking now, years of buried shame pouring out. He knew I'd been trained to freeze, so when he held me down, when he—" She choked on the words. "I couldn't fight, I just shut down, like a switch flipped, and I wasn't even there anymore." Tears burned down her cheeks. She wiped them away furiously, hating herself for crying, for being weak, for proving everyone right, that she was just a victim, just a girl who couldn't save herself. I thought I'd gotten past it, she said, her voice raw. I thought I was stronger. But the second those men grabbed me, I was 8 years old again, and I just disappeared. The silence that followed was suffocating. Then Scott spoke, and his voice was quieter than she'd ever heard it. My mother froze too. Victoria looked up, startled. Scott's hands rested on the table, fingers laced together, knuckles scarred and deliberate. He stared at them like they belonged to someone else. She was gentle, he said. The kind of woman who apologized when people bumped into her, who made herself small so men wouldn't notice her. His voice hardened. But they noticed anyway. Victoria's breath caught. I was 12, Scott continued, his tone flat, clinical, like he was recounting someone else's story. Old enough to understand what was happening, not old enough to stop it. His eyes lifted to meet hers, and for the first time, Victoria saw something beneath. The stone, a wound that had never healed. The men who hurt her knew she wouldn't fight back. And when I tried, he paused, his jaw working. I wasn't strong enough yet. Victoria's heart shattered. She died when I was 14, Scott said, and I promised myself that I would never watch someone freeze again, that I would never stand by and do nothing. The weight of his words settled over the table like a shroud. You didn't freeze because you're weak, Scott said, his voice low and certain. You froze because you survived. That's not the same thing. Victoria's throat closed. No one had ever said that to her. No one had ever looked at her shame and called it endurance. But they still hurt me, she whispered. And they won't again. Scott stood, adjusting his jacket with the same precise movements Victoria had come to recognize. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a crisp bill, and placed it on the table, far more than his drink cost. He looked down at her one last time, his dark eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her chest ache. No one will ever do that to you again, Victoria, he said quietly. I'll make sure of it. Then he walked out, leaving her alone in the empty bar with the echo of a promise she didn't know if she could believe. But for the first time in years, she wanted to. The district shifted like a living thing, rewiring itself around a new law that no one had written down, but everyone understood. The rusted sparrow is protected territory. Victoria noticed the changes slowly at first. A group of women, young, nervous, clutching their purses, came in on a Friday night and asked specifically for a table near the back. They ordered cheap wine and stayed for hours, talking in voices that gradually grew louder, more relaxed as the night wore on. This place feels different, one of them said as Victoria cleared their glasses. Safer, you know? Victoria nodded, unsure how to respond. But she understood. She felt it too. More women came. College students studying for exams, older women meeting after work, mothers escaping loud houses for an hour of peace. They filled the booths, laughed without looking over their shoulders, existed without apology. And the men who used to prowl the bar like predators circling prey? They behaved. They kept their voices low. They tipped well. They didn't leer, didn't linger, didn't test boundaries. Their eyes flicked nervously to the corner booth where Scott sat each night, silent and immaculate, and they made their calculations quickly. This isn't worth it. Victoria felt the change in herself, too. Small things at first, speaking without her voice shaking when she took orders, walking with her shoulders back instead of hunched forward, making eye contact instead of staring at the floor. One night, she wore her hair down, loose curls framing her face instead of pulled back in that severe, invisible bun. Marcus did a double take when she walked in. You look good, he said, surprised. Victoria smiled, a real smile, not the tight, polite mask she usually wore. Thanks. She started wearing lipstick. Dark red, bold, the kind of color that said, I'm here instead of please don't see me. She bought a new shirt, fitted, flattering, and wore it without the constant fear that someone would take it as an invitation. She wasn't healed, not even close. But she was learning to breathe again. Scott watched it all from his corner, his expression unreadable, his whiskey glass always half full. He never commented, never praised, he just observed. And somehow, that was enough. But the district had a long memory. 3 weeks after the back room, in a cramped apartment 8 blocks away, Derek Haynes sat on a stained couch, his wrists still wrapped in medical tape, his pride shattered worse than the bones Scott Bird had snapped like kindling. He stared at his phone, scrolling through the video his friend had filmed before it all went to hell. Victoria pinned to the table, her face twisted in fear. The way the room had been his for exactly 12 seconds before the man in the black suit turned him into a cautionary tale. The humiliation burned hotter than the pain. "You just gonna sit there?" his cousin asked from the kitchen, cracking open a beer. "Or you gonna do something about it?" Derek's jaw clenched. "I'm doing something." He'd been watching, learning Scott's patterns. The man arrived at 9 p.m. like clockwork, stayed until closing, walked out the front door alone. Untouchable. Arrogant. But even monsters had blind spots. And Victoria? She left through the back alley every night, alone, unprotected. Derek smiled through the pain in his wrists. "I'm definitely doing something." Scott felt it before he saw it. The way certain men lingered too long across the street, the car that idled at the corner 3 nights in a row, the shift in the air, subtle but unmistakable, the scent of gasoline and stupidity. He increased his hours at the bar, arriving earlier, staying later. He positioned one of his men, silent, invisible, on the rooftop across the street with a clear view of the alley. He made calls, quiet and efficient, ensuring every informant in the district understood. If something happens to the girl, everyone pays. But he didn't tell Victoria. She was finally starting to unfold, like a flower that had been crushed underfoot learning to stand again. He wouldn't poison that with fear. Not yet. Not unless he had to. So he watched. And he waited. Victoria locked the back door of the Rusted Sparrow at 1:47 a.m., humming softly to herself, a song she hadn't thought about in years, something her mother used to sing. The alley was dark, the streetlight at the far end flickering weakly, but she didn't feel afraid. Not anymore. She adjusted her purse, started toward the street, and didn't notice the shadow detaching itself from the dumpster 20 feet behind her. Didn't see the car pulling up slowly at the alley's mouth, headlights off. Didn't hear the footsteps closing in, deliberate and quiet, until it was almost too late. Almost. Because Scott Bird had been watching, and he was already moving. Victoria's keys jingled in her hand as she locked the back door, the metallic click echoing down the narrow alley. The night air was cool against her skin, carrying the familiar scent of garbage and rain-slicked asphalt. She adjusted her purse strap, started walking toward the street, and froze. A black sedan sat at the alley's mouth, headlights off, engine idling, blocking the exit. Her pulse spiked. Old instinct screamed at her to run, but her legs locked, her body betraying her the way it always had. Then the car doors opened. 4 men stepped out, silhouettes against the distant streetlights. She recognized the shape of the one in front immediately. Broad shoulders, shaved head, one arm held stiffly in a sling. Derek Haynes. "Evening, sweetheart," he called out, his voice thick with mockery and pain. He moved forward slowly, flanked by 3 others. One carried a tire iron, tapping it against his palm with a rhythmic thunk, thunk, thunk. Another cracked his knuckles. The third, Derek's cousin, she guessed from the family resemblance, grinned like a hyena scenting blood. Victoria's back hit the brick wall. Trapped. "Scott ain't here tonight," Derek said, his smile cruel despite the pain etched into his face. "Checked myself. He left 20 minutes ago. You're all alone." Victoria's hands trembled. She forced herself to speak, her voice stronger than she expected. You should leave. Before what? Derek laughed, sharp and bitter. Before your boyfriend shows up? He already left, Princess. This time, nobody's coming. The men advanced, spreading out to cut off any escape. The tire iron gleamed dully in the weak light. Victoria's vision narrowed. Her breath came in shallow gasps. She tried to remember everything she'd learned over the past weeks, the strength she'd been rebuilding, the voice she'd been finding. But her body was screaming at her to freeze, to disappear, to survive the only way it knew how. Derek reached for her, and the world exploded into light. Floodlights slammed on from the rooftops on both sides of the alley, blinding and absolute, turning night into surgical brightness. Victoria threw up her hand, squinting against the glare. Derek stumbled backward, cursing. Then the shadows moved. 6 men emerged from doorways, from behind dumpsters, from alcoves Victoria hadn't even noticed. They didn't run. They didn't shout. They simply appeared, silent as ghosts, forming a wall that closed the alley into a cage. And from the darkness behind Victoria, footsteps. Measured. Deliberate. Scott Bird stepped into the light. He wore the same black suit, perfectly pressed despite the hour. His hands hung loose at his sides, tattooed knuckles catching the harsh glow. His face was carved from stone, expression empty of everything except cold, lethal certainty. Derek's courage evaporated. His eyes darted left, right, searching for an exit that didn't exist. His men backed up, the tire iron hanging forgotten in suddenly nerveless fingers. Mr. Bird, Derek stammered. We were just... Scott didn't let him finish. He closed the distance in 3 strides, stopping inches from Derek's face. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried through the alley like a death sentence. You had your chance. Derek tried to step back. Scott's hand shot out, gripping the front of his jacket, holding him in place. I broke your wrists, Scott continued, his tone conversational, almost gentle. I could have done worse. I showed mercy because I thought you'd learned. I did, I swear. But you came back. Scott's grip tightened. You brought friends. You hunted her like an animal. The enforcers stepped closer, tightening the circle. No one touched the attackers. They didn't have to. The threat was written in their stillness, in the way they watched with dead eyes and patient hands. Scott leaned in, his voice dropping even lower. You return again. You even think about her. I won't stop at your hands. Do you understand me? Derek nodded frantically, tears streaming down his face. Yes, I understand. Say it. I won't come back. I swear to God. Scott released him. Derek stumbled backward, nearly falling. His cousin caught him, and the 4 men scrambled toward their car, tripping over themselves, the tire iron clattering forgotten onto the pavement. The sedan screeched out of the alley, taillights disappearing into the night. Scott turned to Victoria. She was still pressed against the wall, shaking, her eyes wide with shock, and something else. Something that looked almost like awe. Are you hurt? He asked quietly. She shook her head, unable to find words. Scott gestured to one of his men, who melted back into the shadows. The floodlights cut out, plunging the alley back into darkness. The enforcers disappeared as silently as they'd arrived, until only Scott remained. Come on, he said. I'll drive you home. They didn't speak during the drive. Scott's car, a sleek black sedan with leather seats that probably cost more than Victoria's entire year of rent, moved through the empty streets like a predator gliding through water. When he pulled up outside her apartment building, Victoria finally found her voice. You knew, she whispered. You knew they'd come. Scott's hands rested on the steering wheel, his expression unreadable in the dim light. Yes. Why didn't you warn me? He looked at her then, and for a moment the mask slipped. She saw something raw beneath the stone, something that looked like regret. Because you were finally learning to walk without fear, he said quietly. I didn't want to take that away from you. Victoria's chest ached. She didn't know if she should be angry or grateful, maybe both. Thank you, she said. Scott nodded once. Go inside, lock your door. Victoria stepped out of the car, then paused, looking back through the open window. Will they come back? Scott's expression hardened into something absolute. No, they won't. She believed him. The rusted sparrow became something it had never been before. Sanctuary. Word spread through the district like smoke through cracks. Quiet, inevitable, impossible to contain. Women who'd spent years avoiding certain streets, certain bars, certain men, started showing up in groups of 3 and 4. They claimed the booths near the windows, ordered drinks without checking the exits first, laughed without looking over their shoulders. The regulars noticed. The predators especially. Men who used to treat the bar like hunting grounds now sat with their backs straight and their voices low. They said please and thank you. They tipped well. They didn't let their eyes linger too long or their hands wander at all. Because Scott Bird's corner booth was occupied every night, and everyone understood what that meant: behave or become a cautionary tale. Victoria felt the shift in her bones. She walked taller now, shoulders back, chin up. She wore her hair down more often, chose clothes that fit instead of hid. She smiled at customers, real smiles, not the tight, placating masks she used to wear. And when trouble came, she didn't freeze. It was a Tuesday night, slow and quiet, when a man at table 6 snapped his fingers at her like she was a dog. Hey, I've been waiting 10 minutes for my drink. What the hell are you doing back there? The old Victoria would have apologized, would have shrunk, would have made herself smaller to absorb his anger. The new Victoria stopped mid-stride and turned to face him. I'm serving other customers, she said, her voice clear and calm. I'll get to you when it's your turn. The man's face reddened. Do you know who I am? No, Victoria said, meeting his eyes without flinching. And I don't care. You'll wait like everyone else or you can leave. The bar went silent. The man half rose from his seat, his mouth opening to escalate. Then his eyes flicked past Victoria to the corner booth. To Scott, who had set down his whiskey and was watching with an expression that could freeze blood. The man sat back down. Fine, whatever. Victoria nodded once and walked away, her heart pounding but her hands steady. Behind her, she heard a woman at the next table whisper to her friend, Did you see that? Hell yes, I saw that. The murmurs rippled through the room, admiration, surprise, something that felt almost like hope. Over the following weeks, other women found their voices too. A waitress snapped back at a customer who grabbed her wrist. A bartender refused to serve a man who called her sweetheart one too many times. A regular, a quiet woman in her 40s who'd been coming to the bar for years, stood up to her date when he got aggressive about splitting the check. Each time, the room held its breath. Each time, Scott's presence in the corner was a silent guarantee. You're allowed to stand up for yourself here. I'll make sure of it. The Rusted Sparrow wasn't just a bar anymore. It was proof that the rules could change, that women didn't have to make themselves small to stay safe. One Friday night, during a rare lull, Marcus leaned against the bar beside Victoria and gestured toward the crowded room with his chin. You see that? He said quietly. This place used to be half empty most nights. Now look at it. Victoria looked. Every booth was full. Women laughing, talking, existing without fear. Men behaving like decent human beings for maybe the first time in their lives. It's different, Victoria agreed. It's because of you, Marcus said. You and him. He nodded toward Scott's booth. People feel safe here now. Women especially. Victoria's throat tightened. She didn't know how to respond to that. To the idea that her survival, her transformation, had created something bigger than herself. She glanced at Scott. He was watching the room with his usual quiet intensity, his whiskey glass untouched. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second, and something passed between them, an understanding that didn't need words. He nodded once. She nodded back. Marcus chuckled softly. "You two are something else." Victoria smiled despite herself. "We're not. It's not like that." "I know," Marcus said, "but whatever it is, it's working." That night, as Victoria cleared the last tables before closing, a young woman approached her, college-aged, nervous, clutching her purse. "I just wanted to say thank you," the woman said quietly. I've been scared to go out at night for months. My ex, she swallowed hard. But I heard this place was safe, so I came. And you were right there, telling that guy off, and I needed to see that, to see someone stand up." Victoria's chest ached. "You don't have to thank me." "Yes, I do." The woman's eyes glistened. "Because you reminded me that I can stand up too." She squeezed Victoria's hand once, then left. Victoria stood in the middle of the empty bar, surrounded by the ghosts of laughter and conversation, and felt something crack open inside her chest. Not pain, not fear, pride. She wasn't the girl who froze anymore. She was the woman who stood. And somehow, against every odd, that was changing the world around her, one quiet act of courage at a time. From his booth, Scott raised his glass slightly, a silent salute to the woman she'd become. Victoria raised hers back. The bar was silent at 2 a.m., every customer gone. Marcus long since disappeared into the back office. Victoria should have been exhausted. It had been a double shift. But she found herself lingering, drawn toward the back room like a ghost returning to the scene of her own haunting. The door creaked as she pushed it open. The room looked ordinary now. Stacked chairs, boxes of supplies, the faint smell of cleaning solution. But her eyes went immediately to the table in the center. The scar was still there. A deep dent in the wood, splintered and dark, roughly the size of a fist, or a head. The owner had tried to replace the table weeks ago, but Scott had stopped him with a single quiet word. No. Victoria moved closer, her fingertips hovering above the damaged surface. She remembered the feeling of it, cold and unforgiving beneath her spine, the weight of hands pinning her down, the certainty that no one would help. But someone had. She traced the edge of the dent, feeling the rough wood catch against her skin. It wasn't a wound anymore. It was a monument, proof that she'd been hurt, and proof that she'd survived. "Do you want it gone?" Victoria spun around. Scott stood in the doorway, hands in his pockets, his suit jacket unbuttoned. He'd removed his tie sometime during the night, the first time she'd ever seen him anything less than perfectly composed. "I didn't hear you come in," she said, her heart still racing. "I know." He stepped into the room, moving with that same controlled grace, stopping a few feet away. His eyes went to the table, then back to her. "The owner asked again last week if he could replace it. I can tell him yes, if you want." Victoria looked down at the scar. The wood had been cheap to begin with, scarred by years of abuse long before her assault added one more mark to its surface. But this mark was different. This one told a story. "No," she said quietly. "Leave it." Scott's expression shifted, barely, just enough to register surprise. "Why?" Victoria's fingers pressed against the dent one more time. "Because it's proof that I survived." She looked up, meeting his eyes. "And because I'm not ashamed anymore." Something flickered across Scott's face. Pride, maybe? Or recognition. He moved closer, standing beside her, looking down at the table with an intensity that made her wonder what he was seeing. "It's proof of something else, too," he said, his voice low and deliberate. "It's proof that men like them no longer run this place." Victoria's breath caught. She understood then. This wasn't just her monument. It was his, a declaration carved in wood and silence. This is what happens when you hurt someone under my protection. The district's afraid of you, Victoria said. Good. Scott's jaw tightened. Fear keeps people honest when decency fails. They stood there in the silence of the back room, side by side, staring at a table that had witnessed both violence and salvation. The air felt heavy with unspoken things. Gratitude, understanding, a bond neither of them knew how to name. I never thanked you properly, Victoria said, for what you did, for what you keep doing. Scott shook his head. You don't owe me thanks. Yes, I do. Victoria turned to face him fully. You gave me something I'd lost a long time ago. What's that? The belief that someone might actually show up. Scott's eyes held hers, dark and unreadable, but she saw the crack in his armor, the place where the man existed beneath the myth. My mother waited for someone to show up, he said quietly. No one ever did. Victoria's chest ached. I'm sorry. Don't be. Scott's voice hardened, but not with anger, with certainty. Just promise me something. What? Promise me you'll never wait for someone to save you again. His gaze intensified. You're strong enough to save yourself now. Victoria's throat closed. She wanted to argue, to tell him she wasn't that strong, that she still froze sometimes, that the fear still lived in her bones. But looking at his face, at the absolute conviction in his eyes, she realized he believed it. And maybe, just maybe, she was starting to believe it too. I promise, she whispered. Scott nodded once, satisfied. He straightened his jacket, preparing to leave. Scott, Victoria called out as he reached the door. He paused, looking back. Thank you for not letting them replace the table. The corner of his mouth lifted, not quite a smile, but close. It's a good reminder, he said, for everyone. Then he walked out, leaving Victoria alone with the scarred table and the quiet understanding that some bonds didn't need names. They just needed to exist, forged in violence, tempered in protection, and strong enough to change a district one silent night at a time. I notice I already wrote Chapter 8 in my previous response. It was combined with Chapter 7. Let me now write the final chapter following your outline. 3 months after the back room, Victoria Hopkins walked home at 2:30 a.m. without looking over her shoulder. The streets were still dark. The district hadn't magically transformed into some safe suburban paradise. Broken streetlights still cast long shadows. The alleys still smelled like garbage and desperation. But something fundamental had shifted, and Victoria felt it in her bones. She wasn't invisible anymore, and she didn't want to be. Her keys jangled confidently in her hand as she unlocked her apartment door. Inside, she kicked off her shoes, made tea, and sat by the window overlooking the street. The city breathed below her. Sirens in the distance, the rumble of late-night traffic, the occasional shout echoing between buildings. Once, these sounds would have made her flinch. Now they were just noise, just life. Her phone buzzed. A text from Mariah, one of the new waitresses Victoria had trained last week. Thank you for today. That guy was being a creep and you shut him down so fast. I want to be like you. Victoria stared at the message for a long moment, something warm and unfamiliar blooming in her chest. She typed back, You already are. You just needed to see it. She set the phone down and sipped her tea, thinking about the woman she used to be. The one who made herself small, who apologized for existing, who believed that silence was the only way to survive. That woman was gone, not erased, but transformed. The scars remained, but they didn't define her anymore. The next night at the Rusted Sparrow, Victoria arrived early and found Scott already in his booth. It was unusual. He typically came at 9, not 7:30. She approached with 2 glasses of whiskey, setting one in front of him and keeping one for herself. Scott raised an eyebrow. You drinking on shift now? Marcus gave me the night off, Victoria said, sliding into the seat across from him. Thought I'd stop by anyway. Scott's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes softened. The bar's become your territory. Our territory, Victoria corrected. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the evening crowd filter in. Women in groups, laughing and relaxed, men behaving like decent human beings, a few nervous first dates, an older couple celebrating an anniversary. The owner wants to expand, Scott said eventually. Asked if I'd invest. Will you? Already did. He took a sip of his whiskey. Figured this place is worth protecting. Victoria smiled. Because of the women who come here? Because of what it represents. Scott's gaze met hers. Proof that predators don't always win. Victoria turned her glass slowly on the table, watching the amber liquid catch the light. You know what's funny? People still think you claimed me, that I belong to you. Does that bother you? It used to. She looked up. But I realized something. I don't belong to you. I never did. But we belong to this, she gestured around the bar, to what we built here, together. Scott nodded slowly, understanding passing between them without need for elaboration. What they had wasn't possession. It wasn't romance. It was something rarer, an alliance forged in violence and maintained through mutual respect. He protected the space. She gave it meaning. The district's changing, Victoria said. Women are standing up more. Men are behaving better. It's not perfect, but it's better, Scott finished. And better is enough. Is it? Victoria challenged gently. For you? Scott was quiet for a long moment, his tattooed hands resting on the table, hands that had broken bones and made grown men flee in terror. My mother never got better, he said finally. She only got worse until there was nothing left. So yes, better is enough. Victoria reached across the table, not touching him, just close enough to bridge the distance. She'd be proud of you, of what you've done. Scott's jaw tightened. He didn't respond, but he didn't need to. Some truths were too heavy for words. As the night deepened and the bar filled with life, Victoria eventually stood to leave. Scott remained in his booth, a silent guardian in expensive clothing. At the door, she paused and looked back. Their eyes met across the crowded room. He nodded once. She nodded back. No words needed, no promises required. Just the unspoken understanding that tomorrow night he'd be in his booth and she'd be behind the bar, and together they'd continue rewriting the rules of a district that had forgotten how to protect its most vulnerable. Victoria stepped out into the night, walking tall through streets that no longer owned her. Behind her, the rusted sparrow glowed warm against the darkness, a sanctuary built on one woman's refusal to stay broken and one man's refusal to look away. And in the back room, the scarred table remained, a monument to pain survived and power reclaimed. A quiet woman had learned to stand. A ruthless man had refused to walk away. And the district would never be the same. Thanks for sticking with this story till the end. If you enjoyed it, you're going to love the next one. It's packed with unexpected turns and heartfelt moments. Click the image on your screen to keep the journey going, and make sure to hit subscribe for more amazing stories. Drop a comment and rate this story from 1 to 10. I can't wait to see what you think.